I had not expected her to be quiet. That is the first thing I remember. Not her face, not the worn linen of the serving dress she had borrowed from the laundry hall, not the tray balanced in her hands with the kind of steadiness that suggested practice at something other than carrying wine. What I remember first is the quality of the silence around her. Every servant in my hall made noise. They scraped heels, clinked cups, whispered at the corners of their mouths when they thought I could not hear. My court was never truly quiet. But she moved through it as though she were not entirely in it, as though she existed in a register just below sound, and the hall around her did not know what to do with that. I noticed her the way I noticed anything that did not fit. It was not admiration. Not yet. It was the reflex of a king who has survived 11 years by cataloging what does not belong. She had arrived 3 days into the deep winter fortnight, when the river road from the eastern territories floods and leaves travelers no choice but to stop at whatever gate opens first. My steward Borath had taken her on without ceremony. We were short of hands for the midwinter assembly, still 6 weeks away, and she came with a name and a district seal of origin that checked against his records. Marit of the Orven district. A widow, the papers said, looking for winter work. He had not thought to ask more. She had not offered more. I did not know any of this the first time I saw her. I was crossing the east corridor toward the council room, my mind already ahead of my body, the trade routes, the border report from my General Eidvar, the 3 lords whose loyalty I had been weighing since autumn. She was coming from the opposite direction with a tray, and she stepped aside without looking up, pressing herself to the wall the way servants do when a king passes. I would have walked by. I almost did. My wolf stopped me. Not loudly. He has never been loud. He is the oldest thing about me, older than my temper, older than my crown, certainly older than my common sense, and he does not act without reason. But in 11 years of ruling Drevin, he had never once slowed my stride over a servant. What he did that morning was subtler. He turned inside me the way a compass needle turns, toward her, not with urgency, with something quieter than urgency and more alarming for it. I kept walking. I had a council to reach. But I remembered her. The winter court of Drevin is not a warm place even in summer. My great hall was built by my grandfather's grandfather for a kingdom that was made of cold stone and colder weather, and it has the bones of a fortress even when it is dressed for feasting, the long timber tables, the iron torch rings, the tapestries that keep the drafts back but do nothing for the chill that rises from the flagstone floor. I have never minded it. Cold is honest. It does not pretend to be something it is not. The lords who came to Winter Court minded it. They huddled in their furred cloaks and drank the heated wine my kitchen produced in quantities large enough to exhaust an army, and told each other that Casvorn of Drevin was as cold as his hall. I had been hearing that since I was 23. I had stopped correcting it. A king known to be cold is harder to underestimate than a king known to be warm. My wolf had accepted a mate bond once in my early years, or tried to. Her name does not matter now. The bond had not held, and when it dissolved, we were both left standing in the wreckage of something that had felt like destiny and turned out to be longing dressed up in the wrong clothes. After that, my wolf had gone quiet on the subject. He was present always. I felt him in every decision I made, in the steadiness behind my anger, in the restraint I exercised when lesser instincts would have had me act rashly. But he had not turned toward a woman in 11 years, not until the morning in the East Corridor. I told myself it was nothing. 11 years of quiet made any small sound seem significant. I watched her anyway. It was Lord Fenrath who gave me the first real piece of the puzzle, though he did not know he was doing it. Fenrath was one of the 3 lords whose loyalty I had been weighing. He was old money, old bloodlines, the kind of man who used condescension as a weapon and aimed it at anyone beneath his station with the reflexive precision of long practice. He came to my hall for the winter court and immediately began the quiet work of reminding every servant who he was and what they were, in the way of men who need the reminder more than the servants do. I was at the high table, reviewing the border report with Eidvar, when Fenrath called the woman. She was refilling cups at the far end of the lower table, over to him in the old tongue. The old tongue, not the common speech, not the dialect of the eastern districts that she was supposed to have come from. He was testing her, deliberately, with the language of the pack nobility, the one that no one of ordinary birth spoke fluently because it was taught only in the ruling halls. He was, in his habitual way, trying to make her feel small. She crossed to him without hurrying, set the wine ewer down, and answered him in the old tongue. Not haltingly, not with the stumbling effort of someone who had picked up phrases in passing, fluently, with the precise grammatical register that indicated she had learned it not as a curiosity but as a language she was expected to use. Fenrath went still. Then his eyes narrowed, and he said something I could not hear at that distance, and she looked at him with an expression of absolute, pleasant blankness and switched to common speech, and said she had not understood the question. It was a perfect performance. It had happened and unhappened in the span of 20 seconds, and the table around them had seen and not seen it, and Fenrath was left deciding whether he had imagined it. I had not imagined it. I kept my eyes on the border report. Eidvar was explaining something about the northern passes, and I nodded in the right places, and every thread of my attention was elsewhere. I found Boreth that evening. "The woman you hired for the winter fortnight," I said, "Marit of the Orven district." He went through his records. The name was there. The district seal was there. The record of a widow, 32 years of age, seeking winter work, everything in order. "The Orven district," I said. "What is their primary dialect?" "Common speech, my king. They haven't used the old tongue in that territory in 2 generations. "And the district seal who issued it?" He looked at me with the careful expression of a man who understood that something had shifted. "I can send to Orven and ask." "Do that," I said, quietly. I did not tell him why. I did not know, yet, whether the thing taking shape in my understanding was what I thought it was. A woman with borrowed papers and a dead woman's name, and the old tongue in her mouth was not necessarily what I was beginning to think she might be. There were any number of explanations. My wolf did not find any of them satisfying. She was careful. That is what made watching her difficult and, in spite of myself, compelling. She was careful the way a person is careful when they have learned by necessity, not rigidly, not anxiously, but with the loose, continuous readiness of someone who has understood for a long time that discovery is always possible and has made her peace with vigilance. She did not draw attention. She was not shy, I could see, when I watched her move through the hall, that she was observing everything, that behind the silence there was a mind cataloging and assessing with an efficiency I would have valued in any of my officers. But she offered nothing of herself. She answered when addressed. She carried, poured, brought, and cleared. She did not volunteer opinions or stories. She did not position herself near conversations she should not overhear, but she heard them anyway. I was certain of this, watching her eyes when she crossed through one cluster of lords debating something and emerged from it fractionally stiller, as though she had filed what she'd heard. She was, I thought, protecting something. The question was what? And then Boreth came back to me, 4 days after I had sent him, with a report that rearranged everything. "The district seal is genuine," he said. "The name Marit of Orven is genuine, but Marit of Orven died 11 years ago. The seal has not been used since. Whoever forged the travel papers had access to original archival material, not a copy, not a reproduction. The original. 11 years. There are no coincidences in the life of a king who has been alive long enough to know what coincidence costs. The year my mate bond had dissolved, the year I had stopped expecting the thing my wolf was waiting for, was 11 years ago. "Thank you," I said. "This stays between us." "As you say, my king." I sat alone in my study for a long time after he left, listening to the winter river through the shuttered window, and I thought about what kind of woman uses the name of a dead girl and speaks the old tongue and moves like someone trained in observation and concealment, and arrives at a king's court in the middle of winter with no one looking for her and no explanation volunteered. And I thought about which bloodlines had been erased 11 years ago. There had been only one. The name came to me the way names come when you have been keeping them locked away, suddenly and fully formed, with all the weight of what they mean attached. Solène. The Solène bloodline had ruled the Eastern Territories for 400 years before the territory was absorbed into Drevin in my grandfather's time. The absorption had been peaceful, or the history books called it peaceful. My grandmother's private letters, which I had read as a young man, told a more complicated story. The Solène lords had agreed to the union and stepped back from governance and spent 3 generations building a smaller, quieter kind of influence, the kind that does not need a seat at the table to shape what happens around it. And then, 11 years ago, they had vanished. Not quickly, not all at once. Over the course of about 8 months, the adult members of the Solène line had died, one by one, of circumstances that were individually unremarkable and collectively impossible. A fever, a fall, a river crossing gone wrong, an infection. By the time the pattern became visible to anyone who was looking, and I had been looking, because something in that sequence had troubled me from the first death, there was almost no one left to see it. I had investigated. I had not found enough to name the responsible parties with the certainty a king needs before he acts. I had filed what I found and kept watching, but the line was gone, and there was no one to protect, and the conspiracy, whatever it had been, had subsided into silence. The Solène line was known for 3 things in the lore of the Pack courts: their long memory, their gift for languages, all the languages, including the old tongue, which they maintained in their private schooling long after it had faded from general use, and their bond. The bond. It was the thing that had always set them apart, and that made certain factions of the old nobility uneasy about them, and that the history books mentioned in a tone of careful neutrality designed to say as little as possible. The Solène bloodline carried what the lore called a pre-bond, a destined mate connection that formed not at first contact, but in the wolf's awareness, sometimes before the woman of that line was even born. The stories were old, older than Drevin. They said that the last Solène heir, when she walked into the hall of the king her blood was meant for, would be known first not by the king but by the king's wolf, that the wolf would know before the king understood what he was seeing, that the bond would have been waiting. I sat in my study with the winter river outside and my wolf perfectly still inside me, not the stillness of absence but the stillness of something complete, and I thought, how long have you known? He didn't answer. He never answers. He simply waited the way he had been waiting apparently for 11 years. I did not confront her, not immediately, in part because confronting her in my own hall before I understood the full shape of what she was hiding and why would have served neither of us. In part because whoever had erased the Solène line 11 years ago had clearly not found her, and the last thing I intended to do was make it easier for them to find her now by drawing attention to the interest I was taking. And in part, this is harder to admit, but a man who has kept his own counsel long enough learns to be honest with himself about his motivations, because I wanted to watch her a little longer. Because every morning in those weeks she moved through my hall, and every morning my wolf turned toward her with the quiet, certain gravity of a compass finding its bearing, and I was not ready to close the distance yet. I was not ready for whatever would happen when I did. So I watched. I watched her handle Fenrath, twice more, with the same seamless deflection, giving him enough that he couldn't call her insolent and nothing real. I watched her notice, on the morning of the second week, that 2 of the kitchen staff were being disciplined by the head cook in a manner that went past firmness into something harder, and I watched her, quietly, without drama, with the economy of someone who had learned to calculate the smallest effective intervention, do something that resulted in the cook being distracted long enough for the situation to de-escalate. She did not take credit for it. She was carrying cups when the cook looked up again. I watched her pause one afternoon at the old silver display case in the North Corridor, the one that held the pieces collected before my grandfather's time, the things that predated the absorption of the Eastern Territories. She paused at the case and her gaze went to one piece in particular, a flat brooch in the shape of a running wolf, the Solon family crest, the kind of piece my curators had catalogued as Eastern Territorial, origin uncertain. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she moved on. 3 seconds. But her hand at her side had gone still in that particular way a hand goes still when it is being restrained from reaching. I thought, she knows that piece. She has known things like it all her life. That evening, I went to the case myself and stood in front of the Solon brooch and tried to understand what I was going to do about the woman in my hall, who was almost certainly the last of a bloodline I had failed to protect 11 years ago, whose survival depended on the continued assumption that she was no one, and whose wolf bond had apparently been waiting for me since before I knew what I was missing. What I came to, standing there, was this: I would not expose her. Whatever was required to protect her, I would do. The conspiracy that had erased her family would not have her, and when the time was right, when I had found enough of the shape of the thing to move against it, I would give her back her name. After that, if she chose me as freely as the bond chose us, I would spend the rest of my life being grateful. She noticed that I was watching her. I had known she would, she was too observant not to. What I had not anticipated was how she would respond. She didn't avoid me. She didn't become more careful or more closed. What she did was begin to watch me back. Not obviously. She was far too skilled for obvious. But I had been a king for 11 years and I knew how attention moved in a room, and I knew, at some point in the 3rd week, that when I crossed the hall or entered a space where she was working, I was being assessed. Not with fear, not even with particular wariness. With the same quality of intelligent watchfulness that she brought to everything else in my court, but this time directed inward, as though she was trying to understand what I was. I found this, to my considerable surprise, warming. No one assessed me that way. Lords looked at me with calculation or deference, depending on which they needed at any given moment. My officers looked at me with the trained attentiveness of men whose jobs depended on reading my intentions correctly. Fenrath and his kind looked at me with the particular combination of envy and resentment that old money directs at power it considers insufficiently respectful of its pedigree. But she looked at me the way she looked at the old silver in the display case, as though she were attempting to understand something that was genuinely interesting to her, something she hadn't resolved yet. It was the most honest attention anyone had paid me in years. One evening I was sitting alone at the high table after the hall had cleared. It happened sometimes. I would stay with the last of the wine and the dying fire when I had thinking to do, and the servants would drift out and leave me to it, and I looked up and she was still there. The hall was empty but for her, clearing the last cups from the lower table, and she had not noticed yet that I had stayed. I watched her work in the quiet. She moved through it as she moved through everything, with that particular economy, that practiced silence. The fire threw her shadow long across the flagstones. She had a line of concentration between her brows and she was thinking about something, whatever it was, with her whole mind, which made the absent motion of her hands look like something she was barely directing. Then she glanced up and saw me. A lesser person would have startled. She simply went still for exactly 1 beat, and then set the cup she was holding down on the table and looked at me with that composed, watchful expression that I had come to think of as her true face. Not the pleasantly blank performance she gave the court, but this, attentive, guarded, genuinely present. "I can finish in the morning," she said, "if my lord wishes to sit." "I don't wish you to stop," I said. She nodded once and went back to her work, but she had heard the thing I hadn't said, which was that I wanted her to stay in the room. I could tell she had heard it. We stayed like that, she working, I watching the fire in a silence that was different from every other silence in my hall. It was inhabited, that silence. It had something living in it. When she finished, she took her tray and walked toward the kitchen passage, and at the door she paused, not turning, just pausing, and said, to the stone doorframe, "Thank you, my lord, for the evening." Not for the silence, for the evening, as though we had shared something which, in the way of two people who guard themselves by not speaking, we had. I sat with that long after she was gone. Bareth came to me in the 4th week, with news that made my blood go cold. He had found what he was looking for in the border records, a man named Vorn Cassett, who held a minor hereditary title in the southeastern reaches of the territory, and who had, 11 years ago, been among the council members who oversaw the administrative dissolution of the Solent lands after the last of the line appeared to have died. The territory had been folded into the general holdings. The process had been handled by a committee of 3. Cassett was the only survivor of that committee. The other 2 had died in the years since of the same unremarkable variety of incident that had claimed the Solent family. "He is coming to court," Bareth said. He received an invitation for the midwinter assembly. His acceptance arrived this morning. I looked at Bareth for a long moment. Did he request the invitation, or was it sent on standing protocol? Standing protocol, my king. Lords of his level are invited as a matter of course. Standing protocol. So he had not maneuvered himself toward her. He did not know she was here. But he was coming in 2 weeks into a hall where she was working, and Vorn Cassett had spent 11 years being very thorough about loose ends. "Tell me everything you have found on Cassett," I said. "I want every piece of it. And then I want you to go back into the records from 11 years ago and find me every thread that connects the Solent deaths to his council committee. I need it before the assembly." Bareth's expression did not change, but his eyes had the particular sharpness of a man who understood that what I was doing had weight. "Yes, my king." That night I sat with what I knew, and I thought about how to protect her without revealing that I knew who she was, and I arrived at the same conclusion I had been circling since the beginning. I could not do this in the dark. At some point before the assembly, I would have to speak to her. The bond had known her from the first morning. I had simply taken longer than my wolf to catch up. I found her in the kitchen passage on an afternoon when the hall was loud with the arriving retinues of the First Assembly lords, 3 days before Cassett was due to arrive. She was returning from the well courtyard with a water jug, and she turned a corner and there I was, which for anyone else in my household would have resulted in immediate, elaborate apology. She looked at me, measured the situation, and waited. "Walk with me," I said. I did not frame it as a question. She was watching me with that honest assessment, and there was something in her eyes that told me she had been expecting something like this. Not this exactly, but a reckoning of some kind. I took her to my study and closed the door. I did not offer her a chair, not because I meant to be unkind, but because I needed her to be able to read me clearly, and for that I needed to be standing. I put my hands behind my back and looked at her and said, without preamble, "I know you are not Marit of the Orvin district." She did not flinch. She looked at me with those steady dark eyes and waited for me to finish. "I know who you are," I said, "or I believe I do, and I need you to tell me if I am wrong because what I am about to tell you depends on it." Still nothing. Composed, guarded, but she was listening with every part of herself, and in the quality of her stillness there was no fear, there was wariness, and there was calculation, and there was something else, something quieter that I could not name yet. "The Solent line was not completely erased 11 years ago," I said. Her breath changed. Just fractionally, a cautant-release thing that most people would not have noticed, and that told me everything I needed to know. "One of them survived," I said. Young enough at the time to be hidden, old enough to understand what was being done to her family and why she needed to disappear. She would be now approximately 30 years old. She would speak the old tongue as a first language. She would know the Solène sigil on sight without being told what it was. She would move through a dangerous world with the careful competence of someone who has been surviving by her own intelligence and vigilance for a very long time. The room was very quiet. "Tell me," I said, "if I am wrong." She was silent for 5 full seconds. Then she said, in the old tongue with a precision that was deliberate, showing me what she was, clearly and without apology. "You are not wrong, my king." The old tongue, her own register, her actual voice underneath the borrowed one. It was lower than the voice she used in the hall, quieter, more certain of itself, and my wolf at the sound of it simply settled, the way something settles when it has been searching a long time and finds what it was searching for. Not triumph, not urgency, something simpler and more permanent than either of those. I said in the old tongue, "Your name." She looked at me, and for the first time since I had found her in my hall, the careful arrangement of her expression shifted into something truer, something that was, underneath its control, both exhausted and wondering, the expression of someone who has not heard their own name spoken by anyone in 11 years and has just been asked to say it aloud. "Len," she said, "Len of Solène." I told her about Cassette. I told her what I had found, what I suspected, what was still incomplete in the record. I told her he would be arriving in 3 days, and that I intended to have enough documented before the assembly to name him before witnesses, and that until then her safety required that she remain exactly as she had been, unremarkable, unnamed. She listened without interrupting. She asked 2 questions, both of them precise and useful, the kind of questions that told me she had been thinking about Cassette, or someone like him, for years. She understood the shape of the conspiracy better than I did in some ways. She had been inside it. There were others involved, she said. Cassette was not acting alone. He needed access to the archive records. He needed someone in the witness system to make the deaths appear isolated. I spent 2 years after the fact trying to identify the whole of it before I accepted that I did not have enough resources to finish the work alone. "Tell me what you have." She told me. It took the better part of an hour, and at the end of it I had more threads in hand than I had found in 11 years of my own investigation, and the understanding that this woman had been doing what I had been doing, building a case, quietly, alone, for the same length of time. The difference was that she had been doing it without a king's resources, without a court, without an ally of any kind. She had been doing it as a ghost. At the end of it, we sat across the study table from each other in a silence that was different from the one in the hall. It had edges in it, the edges of the thing we were not yet discussing. "Why here?" I said finally. "Why my court?" She looked at me steadily. "Because the Solène records the originals, not the copies in the archive. The actual original records from before my grandfather's time were transferred to Drevin's royal holdings at the absorption. Whatever proof still exists of what my family was, it is here, in your archive, if it has not been destroyed." Practical, of course, she had come for the records. And then she said, quietly, without looking away, "And because it was always going to be here. I did not understand why, for a long time, but I was drawn to Drevin in a way that I could not explain by practicality alone." She did not say, "I was drawn to you." She was too careful for that. But my wolf heard what she meant, because he had been meaning the same thing for 11 years. The 3 days before Cassette arrived were the strangest of my adult life. She was still in the hall, still carrying trays, still unnamed. I was still a king with an assembly to manage and a conspiracy to document and a court full of lords who needed handling. On the surface, nothing had changed. Beneath the surface, everything had. She looked at me now with something different in it, not less guarded, but differently guarded. The wariness was still there, but it had a quality of chosen restraint in it rather than pure survival. She had decided to trust me, or to proceed as though she had decided to trust me, which for someone with her history amounted to the same thing. She watched me manage the arriving lords, and I could see, in those clear dark eyes, a kind of attentiveness that was no longer purely evaluative. It was something warmer than evaluation, beginning to form. I came close to her twice in those days, passing in corridors, and each time my wolf pulled toward her with that same settled, permanent gravity, and I kept my face neutral and my pace even and thought, 4 more days. Boreth, working with the 2 people I trusted most in my council, spent those days on the archive. They found it. On the second day, in a section of the holdings that had not been catalogued in 30 years, they found a document box stamped with the Solène seal, not the copied records, the originals. Contracts, lineage records, the original mate bond documentation from 400 years of Solène history, and in the most recent pages, dated 11 years ago, a testament written in an old man's hand that named Vorn Cassett and 2 others as the parties who had come to the Solène estate to discuss the voluntary relinquishment of remaining territorial claims, and who had left, 4 days later, with a document signed under duress and a family that had started dying within the month. The old man had known he was dying and had written it down. He had sealed it and put it in the box, and hoped the box would outlast the people who wanted everything in it gone. It had outlasted them. On the evening of the second day, I sent for her. She came to my study, and I showed her the box, and I stood back and let her open it herself, because it was hers, and I watched her face as she read what her grandfather had written in his last weeks. She read for a long time. She did not cry. She had, I think, spent 11 years in circumstances that required other uses for tears, and the well was either dry or walled off. But when she finished, she set the pages down with a care that was almost painful to witness, the care of someone handling something they have believed gone and found, against all probability, returned, and she sat for a moment in the study quiet with her hands flat on the table. Then she looked at me. "The testament names him," she said. "Yes. It is admissible before a full assembly." "It is." She was calculating. I watched her calculate. She was thinking about what happened next, what came after the naming, what it meant for her position, what it meant for the survival strategy that had kept her alive for 11 years, whether the thing she was about to step into was safe to step into. I said, "I will stand with you." She looked at me for a long time. Then, "You understand what I am, what my bloodline is, what the lore says about the bond." "I have understood for some time," I said, "what my wolf was telling me." She was quiet. Then she said, with the particular precision she brought to everything that mattered, "I did not come here because of the bond. I came here for the records." "I know." "If I had come here for the bond," she stopped. "Then you would have come differently," I said. "You would not have been the person who survived 11 years alone. I am not asking you to have come for the bond. I am asking you to let me stand with you in 4 days, and to let what follows be what it is." She looked at me for a long time. "Yes," she said. The midwinter assembly of the court of Drevin had not seen a full convening of the lords in 3 years. Typically the summer assembly served that function, and the winter gathering was smaller, social in character, the great concerns of the kingdom held in abeyance until the roads thawed. This winter I had called a full convening. I had done so without explaining why, which was my prerogative, and which had produced in the court the particular kind of taut anticipation that comes when a king does something unexpected. Cassett arrived on the 3rd day. He was a compact, unremarkable-looking man in his middle 50s, with the manner of someone who has spent years being precisely as noticeable as the situation required and not a shade more. He greeted me with the appropriate formalities and went to his assigned place in the hall, and I watched him from across the room and felt a clean, cold anger that had nothing impractical in it. He did not notice her. She was in the hall. I had considered removing her, and had decided against it, because she had asked to be present, and because she had as much right to witness the unraveling of this as anyone alive. But she was stationed at the far end of the server's corridor, and he had no reason to look that way, and he did not. My wolf was very still in those hours before the assembly began. I had asked my wolf privately in the days since she had told me her name to wait, not to act before the timing was right. He had accepted this, which told me he had been paying attention to everything I had and was content that I knew what I was doing. He had been waiting 11 years. He could wait 3 more days. The midwinter assembly of the court of Drevin opens with the formal presentation of the lords, each one named, each one making the formal acknowledgement of their standing within the kingdom. This was tradition, not protocol, which meant it was the kind of thing I could adapt if the situation required. I let the presentations proceed to their natural point. I let the court settle into the familiar rhythms of the assembly, the opening remarks, the first round of the kingdom's accounts, the border reports. I let Cassette find his footing in the hall, let him relax into the assumption that this was an ordinary winter gathering. Then I said, "Before we proceed to the matter of the Eastern boundary agreements, I have a matter of record to place before this assembly. I require all present to attend." The hall went quiet with the particular quality of quiet that tells you everyone in it is paying attention with their whole bodies. I said, 11 years ago, the Solenne bloodline of the Eastern Territories was erased, not by illness or misfortune, as the record states, but by deliberate action, a conspiracy of 3 men who used administrative access and witness manipulation to remove a family that held documentation inconvenient to certain territorial claims. The record of this is in the Solenne archive, which was preserved here, in the Drevin Royal Holdings, and which has been reviewed in full by my senior counsel. I paused. I name Vorn Cassette as the principal of that conspiracy, on the basis of the sworn testament of Lord Edrin of Solenne, the head of that family at the time of the events, signed and sealed 11 years ago, and recovered intact from the Drevin archive 3 days past. The hall erupted, not in chaos. It was a hall full of lords who understood decorum well enough, but in the controlled, barely contained noise of 60 people processing a seismic piece of information simultaneously. Cassette rose from his seat, his face going very white and then very still, which told me everything I needed to know about his guilt and his intelligence. A guilty man who is also smart does not bluster. I let the noise settle. Then I said, "The Solenne line is not ended. There is a surviving heir. She has been in my court for the past 5 weeks, and I will present her to this assembly now." I looked toward the server's corridor. She was already moving. She had known the moment was coming. I had told her the night before exactly when, and she came through the corridor entrance and crossed the hall floor, and every eye in the room followed her as she walked. She was still in the serving dress. She had not changed it by her own choice when I had offered to provide something more suitable. She had said, quietly and with the deliberateness that characterized every decision she made, "Let them see me as I was." She walked to the center of the hall. And then my wolf, who had been still for 11 years and still for the past 3 days, and still through every moment of the assembly's opening, my wolf acted. Not in my own body. The bond does not work the way stories make it sound. There is no external display, no great visible manifestation that the court can witness. What happens is internal. What the court can witness is the consequence. The consequence was that I stood from the high seat. I had not planned this. I had planned to speak her name from where I was seated at the appropriate formal moment. But my wolf had been waiting for 11 years, and the woman who carried his bond was standing in the center of my hall in a servant's dress in front of 60 lords who did not yet know what she was, and I stood up before I had decided to, because there are things the wolf decides before the king catches up. I came down from the high seat, and I walked the length of the hall, and I stopped in front of her. She was looking at me with those steady dark eyes, and in them was everything she kept out of her expression: the exhaustion, the wonder, the careful hope of someone who has not allowed themselves to hope in a very long time and is now deciding, in real time, that it is permitted. I said in the old tongue, loud enough for the hall to hear, "Len of Solène. This court names you and knows you. Your bloodline is restored to the record of Drevin. Your grandfather's testament stands in the archive of this kingdom, and what was taken from your family will be answered for and returned." The hall was completely silent. I offered her my hand. She looked at my hand. She looked at my face. There was a beat, one single beat, in which she decided, and I could see her decide, and I was aware that my own breath was held. Then she put her hand in mine. The bond did not ignite the way I had always understood bonds to ignite, in a flash, in a flare, in the great wolves howling moment the stories describe. What happened was more like a door opening that I had not known was closed. The warmth of her hand in mine, and the warmth of the thing that had been waiting, on both sides of that door, for 11 years, and the wolf going fully, quietly, permanently at ease in a way he had not been since before I was crowned. The hall around us was very still. Cassette behind me had not moved or spoken. He would face the formal charges in proper order, with the documentation before the appropriate counsel, and he would answer for what he had done. I had already seen to the arrangements. What happened in this hall in this moment was not about him. It was about her. I said, still in the old tongue, "Will you stay?" She looked at me for a moment with that honest, careful, clear-eyed attention. "Yes," she said. What followed was not simple. I would not tell it as though it were simple, because she deserved better than a story that made 11 years of loss and survival into a clean resolution, and because she was not the kind of woman who would have believed a simple version even if I had offered it. Cassette was formally charged before the Winter Council and removed from his title and his lands pending trial. The other conspirator still living. The third man was already dead. The records confirmed it, was identified through the documentation in the Solène archive and similarly charged. It took 3 weeks and the full weight of my counsel's attention, and at the end of it the case was built and the sentences handed down. And neither Len nor I spoke in that chamber because we had agreed it was cleaner not to. The records would speak, and they did. Her name was restored in the full public record. The Solène holdings that remained, not all of them, the territory had been absorbed long since, but the ancestral seat and the archive and a portion of the eastern lands that had been held in administrative limbo were returned to her. She could have taken them and left. I had told her this explicitly because it was true and because she needed to hear it from me. The restoration was unconditional. It did not depend on her staying. She had looked at me with that particular expression I had come to read as her version of amusement, which was very subtle and very dry and extremely effective, and said she was aware. She stayed. Lord Fenrath came to me, 2 days after the assembly, with the expression of a man who had several things he wanted to say, and was uncertain how to arrange them into something that would not make his situation worse. I listened to him for a few minutes, and then said that the Solène line had been under the protection of Drevin since the absorption, which protection had failed, and that the court of Drevin and its king considered the restoration of that line a matter of honor, and that any lord who found this reasoning difficult to accept was welcome to say so clearly so that I would know where we stood. Fenrath said he had no difficulty with the reasoning. I thanked him and indicated the door. The thing I had not anticipated, should have, perhaps, but hadn't, was how much space she took up in my hall once she stopped taking no space at all. It was not a dramatic change. She did not suddenly become loud or expansive. She was still precise, still economical, still more likely to watch than to speak in any given room, but the silence she carried changed. It became inhabited differently, not the silence of someone hiding in plain sight, but the silence of someone who has decided where they are standing. I noticed it first in the way the servants began to look at her, not with the indifference they afforded the serving staff, but with the attention that forms around someone who has, without theatrics, made it clear that they see everything and will respond to what they see. She had done nothing overt. She had simply stopped performing invisibility. And I noticed it in myself. I had spent 11 years ruling a cold hall with no one in it who was paying attention to me the way she paid attention to me, and I had told myself that was a king's ordinary life, and I had believed it, and I no longer believed it. She and I walked in the river corridor 3 weeks after the assembly, in the early dark of the winter afternoon, and she was telling me something about the Eastern territorial water rights that she had found in the Solent records, and that had implications for a long-standing dispute between two of my border lords. And I was listening to the argument she was making, which was good, and also watching the way she moved her hands when she was explaining something she found genuinely interesting, which was with a controlled enthusiasm that she did not try to hide, which was entirely unlike every other part of her. She caught me watching and stopped mid-sentence. "You were not following the water rights argument," she said. I said. "The secondary channel diversion was established in the 4th year of my grandfather's reign and was never formally incorporated into the territorial agreements. The border lords have been arguing about the wrong thing for 30 years because no one has consulted the original documentation." She looked at me for a moment. "You were following it," she said. "And watching," I said. "Both things are possible." Something in her expression shifted, that slight, dry quality of warmth she allowed herself occasionally, when she had decided the moment was worth it. "You are a great deal less cold than your reputation, my king," she said. "You are a great deal less contained than your arrival suggested," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, with a deliberateness that was characteristic, the way she handled everything she meant seriously, by being precise about it, she said, "I was contained for 11 years because I had to be. I am not certain I know how to be otherwise." "I think you are learning," I said. She looked ahead at the river corridor, the winter light flat and cold on the stone floor, and she said quietly, "I think I am." The mate bond in the lore of the Solent line does not complete at first contact. I had learned this in the archive, in the old records that described how the pre-bond worked, the wolf's recognition coming before the king's understanding, the gradual convergence of the two, the bond completing only when both parties had chosen, fully, and with clear knowledge of what they were choosing. We chose in the order the Lord described. My wolf first, then my understanding, then her deliberate and clear-eyed and fully voluntary return of the bond. It happened over weeks, not in a single moment, which is perhaps the less dramatic version of the story but was the true one, and the true one suited us both better than drama would have. What I can tell you is that there was a morning in the deep heart of winter, when the river was frozen to its bed, and the hall was quiet before the day began, and she was at the long table in my study reading through the Solent water rights documentation for the border lord's case, and I was reading the trade reports, and neither of us was speaking, and the silence was the inhabited silence, the one with something living in it, and I looked up and she was already looking at me. And we were both perfectly still for a moment, and then she went back to reading and I went back to the trade reports, and the wolf inside me was as settled and complete as a compass that has found its north and has no further business pointing anywhere else. That was when I knew. I asked her formally on the last day of winter, with the river thawing beneath my window and the midwinter assembly 3 months behind us, and the Solent restoration formally entered into the kingdom's public record and Cassette's trial concluded. I asked her in my study, which was where we had been honest with each other from the beginning, and I asked in the old tongue, which was her language first and mine second, because some things should be said in the truest available language. She said yes in common speech, which was deliberate. She told me why afterward, the dry warmth in her eyes. Because in the old tongue, yes, sounds too much like it was inevitable. I wanted you to know I was choosing. I told her I was grateful to have been chosen. She looked at me with those clear dark eyes and said, in the old tongue, quietly, 11 years is a long time to be a ghost. Yes, I said. I did not expect this, she said. At the end of it, I had stopped expecting anything except the next necessary thing. I thought about 11 years of cold halls and a wolf that pointed at a door every time she passed it without me understanding why, and I said, I did not know what I was missing. I should have looked sooner. You could not have found me, she said. I was very careful. My wolf would have found you. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very precisely, yes. I think he would have. She is called Queen of Drevin now, though she has not yet settled into the title. She wears it the way she wore everything in the early weeks, with careful observation, trying to understand what it requires before she commits to how she will carry it. She will carry it exceptionally. I have known this since the afternoon in the East Corridor when my wolf turned toward a door, and I did not yet know what it meant. The lords who were in the hall when she walked across the flagstones in the servant's dress and took my hand have not forgotten it. Fenrath has not forgotten it. The court of Drevin does not forget things, which is one of its less charming qualities, and which in this case I am not sorry for, because I want them to remember exactly what they saw. A woman who survived 11 years in silence, and arrived in my hall without asking for anything, and sat in my silence, and watched me with those honest dark eyes, and who had the entire documented history of her bloodline's destruction in her head, organized and held against the day she would have enough to act on it, and who walked across a winter hall floor in a borrowed servant's dress, and stood in front of 60 lords, and offered me her hand with the calm of someone who has already survived the worst thing that could happen, and is therefore not afraid of anything the next chapter contains. 11 years. My wolf had been waiting 11 years, which means I had been waiting 11 years without knowing it, and everything I had built in that time, the cold hall, the cold reputation, the efficient management of a court that ran well and felt like nothing, was the shape of that waiting emptied out. It is not emptied out any longer. I have her name in the Drevin record, permanent and irrevocable, entered in my own hand the morning after the assembly. Len of Solen, Queen of Drevin, fated mate of Casforn, king, in the full acknowledgement of the Solen pre-bond, witnessed by the assembled lords and attested by the royal archive. I have the water rights dispute resolved, because she spent 3 weeks on the documentation and argued the case before the border lords with a precision that left them without a counter. And afterward one of them told me that the new queen was formidable, with the expression of a man recalibrating his expectations. I have the fire in my study, and the silence with something living in it, and her particular quality of attention, which is the most honest thing I have ever been given. And I have my wolf, at last and completely at rest, settled in a direction he chose before I understood what he was pointing at. That is the whole of it. A woman arrived in my hall in winter, quiet as a compass needle finding north, and my wolf knew before I did. And I am glad of both facts, glad of his certainty and glad of my own slower understanding, because the days of learning to see her were worth having. I would not give them back. She found what she came for in the end. The records, the restoration, the case made and closed, and her family's name returned to the light. And she found what the Solen lore had promised, in the hall that was always going to be hers. So did I.